This is Left Voices for Tuesday, April 8th, 2014. I'm Andrea Sears. Tonight,
there was a real palpable pressure for the district attorney's office and the police department to get the streets cleaned up. But unfortunately, people's constitutional rights were violated in the process.
decades in prison on police and prosecutors' lies. Jonathan Fleming was released from prison today. He spent the last 24 years there for a murder he didn't commit. The evidence is clear. He wasn't in Brooklyn that night in 1989 when Darrell Rush was shot to death. In fact, he wasn't even in New York State. He had the proof in his pocket when he was arrested, but somehow that evidence was never turned over to the defense during the trial and didn't surface again until last year. In Brooklyn, a growing number of convictions from 20 or more years ago are being overturned, some because police lied, coerced witnesses, and planted evidence, but prosecutors, anxious to show they were tough on crime, were no less involved in putting people behind bars for crimes they did not commit. Some, like Jonathan Fleming, have spent years fighting to prove they were framed. Some died in prison before the truth ever came out. And it's not a problem that's unique to Brooklyn or New York City. It's nationwide. Joaquin Sapien is a reporter for ProPublica who's been following the unraveling of cases in Brooklyn. In his article, Brooklyn DA Moves to Free Man After Long-Buried Evidence Surfaces, Sapien says during his trial in 1990 there was plenty of evidence showing that Fleming was with his family at Disney World in Florida at the time of the murder.
He had video footage showing that was the case, and he had plane tickets showing that was the case, and he also had several members of his family testify on his behalf who accompanied him on this trip to Florida. But the prosecutor, James Leeper, made the argument that, in fact, he could have flown to Florida, then flown back to Brooklyn, committed the murder, and flown back to Florida. And for some reason, the defense attorney stipulated to that being a possibility. And the prosecutor also presented one eyewitness who said that she saw Fleming do the shooting at 2:15 in the morning and testified to that at trial. But immediately after the trial, that witness recanted her testimony, saying that she only said what she said because she was threatened with jail time if she didn't cooperate with police. And it turned out that she had been arrested and questioned about the murder and was essentially told that if she agreed to help them, she would not be prosecuted. So when she went to trial, she testified falsely that she saw Fleming from 427 feet away at 2:15 in the morning after a night of smoking crack cocaine. And that was enough for Fleming to be convicted. And ever since then, he's been fighting hard through various appeals, which have been defeated repeatedly by the district attorney's office.
There was also exonerating evidence that wasn't presented at his trial. What was that?
There was a receipt showing that he had paid a phone bill from a hotel in Florida just hours before the murder took place. And Fleming asked his defense attorney at the time of the trial to retrieve that receipt from the prosecutor's office. He said that it was on his person. And the defense attorney did ask for it. He asked for it at trial, and a detective who testified said he had no recollection of that receipt. But what that receipt showed was that at 9:30 on August the 14th, 9:30 p.m., Mr. Fleming had paid a $80 long-distance phone bill at the hotel. And the murder took place at 2:15 on August 15th, so just hours later, which shortens the window at which Mr. Fleming would have had to flown from Florida to New York, done the murder, and flown back. There's also evidence showing that, in fact, the eyewitness who recanted was indeed arrested, and she was indeed not prosecuted because of her cooperation with police. And there was documents to that effect that were never turned over at the original trial.
What happened to this evidence? Why didn't it make it into the original trial?
That's a great question. I think that the investigation on that has yet to be complete. But what happened was the Conviction Integrity Unit of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office under Mr. Hines worked with Fleming's attorneys in re-interviewing witnesses and taking a look at the file that they had, searching for new evidence. And all these years later, as Fleming had maintained, it turned out that there was a receipt showing that this phone bill had been paid. And for some reason, it was just never turned over, and we don't know the answer to that yet. It's possible that the police never gave that receipt to the prosecutor, and therefore the prosecutor didn't even know about it. But it's also possible that it was in the prosecutor's file.
This is not the first conviction to be overturned from the Brooklyn DA's office. There seems to be a whole host of convictions that are now up for review because of tainted evidence, evidence that was concealed, false testimony by police officers, or prosecutorial misconduct. What's the source of this? Is there a single source, or was there a culture of corruption in the Brooklyn DA's office or the police department?
It's hard to pin any of this on a single source when you find so many cases that were tried by so many different prosecutors all around the same time frame, all supervised by the same people, where evidence is now emerging that things were withheld, that these cases weren't tried fairly. So I think that there's a real danger in saying, well, it's just one rogue prosecutor, or, well, it's just one rogue detective. And that does seem to support the assertion that, in fact, there may well have been a cultural problem wherein prosecutors were encouraged to withhold certain pieces of evidence. I think a lot of that is still pending, but it certainly seems to be the perspective from a number of defense attorneys who have looked very deeply at this issue and have filed appeal after appeal on numerous cases and are seeming to find these kinds of patterns. There was a detective named Louis Scarcella who is at the center of a lot of these cases, and I think in some ways he's become a scapegoat for this kind of conduct. And what's happening now is that there's been many, many more cases surfacing involving many, many more detectives and prosecutors where very similar things have gone on.
Well, Louis Scarcella is the subject of an article in the New York Times today. But the prosecutor's office has also for years maintained a hotel room where they took suspects for interviews outside of the DA's department. What was going on there?
That's a subject that we wrote about, too, here at ProPublica, having to do with the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office's use of material witness orders, which are meant to be used only in the most pressing circumstances where a witness has a potential to flee or may not testify for some reason. And what can happen is you're supposed to go to a judge and get a material witness order signed, and then bring that witness in and have him testify as to why he didn't want to come in to trial and testify, and that person is supposed to be assigned a lawyer. But what we discovered is that that step was often skipped, and instead of executing the material witness order through the courts, the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office would simply get one signed and then bring that witness into a hotel room forthwith and basically keep that person there against their will until they agreed to testify, and then go into court and say that this witness was testifying as a result of their own free will, not because they were coerced, not because there was some kind of cooperation, not because they were being held in a hotel against their will for who knows how many days. And that is a policy that I think could affect potentially dozens of cases going forward. An important thing to remember about all of these cases is that these trials often took place in the late 80s and early 90s when crime was rampant in Brooklyn. There was a crack epidemic that law enforcement was dealing with on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the words war zone and chaos are often used by people I talk to describe the streets of Brooklyn at the time. And so I think that there was a real palpable pressure for the district attorney's office and the police department to get the streets cleaned up. But unfortunately, people's constitutional rights were violated in the process. And that's what is now coming to light many years later. And it remains to be seen how many people were actually innocent or actually never had a fair trial back in the 80s and 90s. And we're just beginning to now see evidence of that emerging. And it could be a much bigger problem than anyone ever imagined.
This is Brooklyn. It's one of 5 boroughs in New York City. But is this indicative of what happens in other police departments in other jurisdictions?
I think that there are cases like this that are surfacing all over the country. Dallas also has a conviction integrity unit. They're widely praised for their work in evaluating cases that were made under a previous Dallas district attorney, and there's been several exonerations there. I think the advent of DNA evidence has led to a number of exonerations around the country that have called into question conventional prosecutorial tactics and law enforcement tactics. And almost every one of those exonerations, there was problems with evidence disclosure. There was problems with witness identifications. There was problems with vouching for unreliable witnesses. And so this whole area of criminal justice is beginning to come under scrutiny. And I think we are going to continue to see cases like this emerge, not only in New York, but the rest of the country as well.
Joaquin Sapien is a reporter with ProPublica. This has been Left Voices for Tuesday, April 8th, 2014. You can help support this experiment in independent journalism by visiting our website, www.leftvoices.net, and following the Ways to Support Left Voices link at the top of the page. Join us again tomorrow for more news and information from a progressive perspective. I'm Andrea Sears for leftvoices.net.